32 town meetings, which began after the primary in June, is the first set of open public y'all come town meetings in 2 years. I, in many ways, prefer to refer to it not so much as the COVID 2 years, but as the lost 2 years. The effect that it's had on business and people and education and just everything in our lives. But we're past that, so whatever the new normal is, we're back to doing now. The world's changed some since the last time we were together. When we were last at a town meeting here, I think very rude, a guy by the name of Donald Trump was living at the White House. Now there's somebody by the name of Joe Biden living there. When we were last together, the majority leader of the Senate was a fellow by the name of Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. Now it's Chuck Schumer of New York. Nancy Pelosi was Speaker 2 years ago. She's still Speaker. The legislative lay of the land has changed rather dramatically. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't note that we're not that many days away from the general election. National media pundits like to refer to it as a midterm election. I have a suspicion there will be some changes again on general election day. And that will certainly have an effect on the legislative environment. And that's as much as why I bring that up, is that the legislative environment is a reflection of the political environment, membership of the body. Some would argue the last year and a half, almost 2 years, has not perhaps been the most productive legislative period, but bear in mind, in the House, the difference between the two sides has been 5 seats. Speaker Pelosi is Speaker because there are 5 more Democrats than Republicans out of 435. The United States Senate, for 2 years, it's been a dead even tie, 50-50. Vice President Harris, Kamala Harris, comes in, breaks the tie every morning, hands the gavel to Mr. Schumer. You can't have it that any closer than that. We'll see what the lay of the land is after Tuesday. But from the perspective of my committees, talk about that for a moment, and the world, and whatever you care to talk about. With the 117th Congress winding down, the new session that will begin the first Monday in January will be the 118th Congress. We operate in 2-year cycles. I would expect in this coming session of Congress, after now for 4 years being the ranking member of the senior Republican on the Science, Space, Technology Committee, with control, I think, that will change in the House. I would expect to be chairman next time. And that's the committee with jurisdiction over the National Science Foundation, think of all the research programs, NIST, the entity that sets all the standards, NOAA, the National Weather Service, think of the big facilities down in Norman, Oklahoma, and NASA, the space program, back to the moon, on to Mars, which gets me some interesting discussions sometimes in town meetings in Oklahoma. But that's the committee that I would expect to have the opportunity to chair. It's a committee, much like the Ag Committee, that historically has worked in more of a bipartisan. If you want to be on a committee where they just scream at each other, you go to government oversight, or you go to budget, or you go to judiciary, they just scream at each other. But Ag, Science, there are a number of committees that you don't see on MSNBC every night or Fox, but they're the committees where we make things happen. And in this session of Congress, I was fortunate to have a chairwoman from Dallas by the name of Eddie Bernice Johnson, old school, Southern lady, African American, very focused on making things happen. And we reauthorized the National Science Program, Foundation programs, reauthorized the civilian energy programs down at the Department of Energy. We don't handle the weapons stuff, but the civilian side of the energy equation. We reauthorized NIST. This coming year, I think, in that bipartisan spirit, and I'm not sure yet who my ranking will be if I have the privilege of being chairman, but we'll look at an organic law, a base authorization for NOAA, which was created actually by an executive order, never by statutory law, the National Weather Service. And I would expect that we will work on a longer-term authorization for NASA, not just the manned programs on Mars, but all the research stuff, the unmanned programs, the telescopes, all that sort of thing. In fairness, science committee is lots of fun. is about the future. It's about things that are being created through science. And like all the other programs, education is an important element. We're on campus here, but EBJ and I affectionately use our initials for the chairman. We've been very focused on STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Those are where the overwhelming number of new jobs for the next 25 years will be created in the economy. And how do you make sure that STEM education opportunities are not just around the biggest universities on the East or West Coast, or not just limited to where the biggest corporate entities are? How do you bring that out? EBJ's focus has been on underserved STEM, the inner city areas. My focus has been on rural STEM. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here too. How do you move forward? Science committee's lots of fun. The other committee I serve on, one of the other two committees, is financial services. Cost of and the availability of capital. Think of interest rates, think of the ability to borrow money. The jurisdictions over the Federal Reserve System, Treasury, insurance, Security Exchange Commission, just a variety of things. We've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years within the committee debating both publicly and privately about cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, stablecoin, all that sort of stuff. I would tell you that there's not a clear consensus yet on the committee about where to go on cryptocurrency issues. Whether it's rules and regs the Fed would put together or a potential law that my new incoming chairman, I believe, Patrick McHenry, would offer up. It's kind of the Wild West out there. You've seen the wild gyrations in prices and where it's traded. I would suggest if you invest in cryptocurrency, this is just my advice for what it's worth, what little that is. I would suggest if you invest in cryptocurrency, while there's great potential, only invest the money you don't need. Is that a cautious way of making a statement? Just invest the money you don't need. Until this is sorted out, while there's great potential, there's also great risk. My chairwoman there is Maxine Waters from Los Angeles, California. Maxine was raised one of 13 kids in East St. Louis. Tough upbringing, very sincere, intense, liberal, inherently suspicious of the market economy and capitalism. I've worked with her on export-import bank reauthorizations and a variety of other things. She's one of those people that when you agree with her, or she agrees with you, you can make things happen. When you disagree, then she is a very intense competitor, tough lady. But I respect her dearly. My legacy committee assignment, which I've been on leave from for the last almost 4 years and expect that I will be back on in January, is agriculture. That's my training, agricultural economics. That's my personal profession. And it's the one industry that is everywhere in the 3rd Congressional District. There may not be oil and gas everywhere. We may not have manufacturing everywhere. We may not have a lot of things everywhere. But ag is everywhere in the district. Next year's Farm Bill here. And that's a very important process because Farm Bills, what people think of it as crop insurance programs or livestock indemnity, that kind of thing. And it is the safety net programs that enable producers to deal with issues they have no control over, weather or markets. Nonetheless, it's ag research, it's rural development, it's conservation, it's farm credit, it's all manner of other things that are critically important to the quality of life. Real broadly, critically important to the quality of rural life, the ability to do business in the countryside. If control flips, then I would expect we'll take the 2014 Farm Bill, which was the modification of the 2014 Farm Bill we did when I was chairman, the 3rd generation Farm Bill. The safety net based on concepts of crop insurance, I should say. And we'll go forward with that. In that scenario, the question is, how much money will be available in the budget for us to use on making sure safety net still functions. What do I mean by that? We've had a miserable weather year. Your weather patterns, according to Mesnet, are just as rough as mine are in North Roger Mills County. Our neighbors over the southern two-thirds of the state got some rain the last few days. Did not happen at my house, and I don't think it happened at yours on the Mesnet. So Mother Nature is continuing to bedevil us. The question there is 2014 a one-year anomaly? 2022, is it a one-year anomaly? Or is it like 2011, 12, 13, 14? The 4-year is really well all went through. Weather patterns remain to be seen, but what kind of resources will we have? Producers are dealing with the most dramatic increase in input prices in my lifetime. I price dry nitrogen at home, and I know prices vary from where your buying points are. But I priced the dry nitrogen, well actually the dry nitrogen in 2021 for Linda's Plains Loose Stem Lovegrass at $4.50 a ton, $46.00. When I went in and I thought we were going to get some rain at the beginning of the year, it was $1,050 a ton. Last time I priced it was $6.50 a ton, so that's better. I haven't priced because it's never rained. I don't have any reason to put it down. But we're going through those kind of pressure points. Price of diesel, parts, everything else. So the input costs are eating up producers. At the same time, because of the way crop insurance works now, you have so many bad years, and it begins to affect what the safety net, the value of the disaster. So we have to look at the Farm Bill about if this is a one-year anomaly, we'll be okay. If this is another multi-year Farm Bill, how do you make sure the crop insurance really still is a safety net? And that takes money. And we'll work our way through that. If we're not in control, the chairman of the committee will be a gentleman from Atlanta, Georgia, by the name of David Scott. Nice guy, served with him for years and years and years in the committee. Not a farmer by trade. There's not a lot of agriculture in the city limits of Atlanta. That was a polite way being snide. His claim to fame is he had an advertising account with Coca-Cola for decades. And his brother-in-law is Hank Aaron. Now, I realize if you're not at least 40 years old, you probably never heard of Hank Aaron, but the most amazing baseball player. David's focus is much like the majority's focus on what they refer to as environmental justice and social justice. If they're still the majority, I think you get a dramatic rewrite of the Farm Bill. With a keen focus on making sure that production agriculture is conducted in a certain way, somebody's definition of environmental friendly, and that resources will be driven to achieve social justice. So I'm always concerned. Farm bills have been about resources following production to guarantee a steady and consistent, safe, affordable supply of food and fiber. But if you use farm bills to determine who can farm and what they can farm, that takes us dramatically off the course we've been on since 1933. That concerns me a great deal. Stepping away from that for a moment. Things go on and I'll speed up that we have no control over, basically. As we saw with input prices and wild swings in the price of wheat, when the Russians invaded their neighbors, the Ukrainians, it just turned the other side of the planet upside down. I've gotten a lot of text messages and emails from folks and letters about don't spend money in Ukraine, don't spend money in Ukraine. Well, let me suggest this to you. The Ukrainians did not invade the Russians. The Russians invaded the Ukrainians. When I say Russians, I probably should say Putin invaded Ukraine. They're fighting to stay away from being reincorporated in the Russian Empire, the new Soviet Union, or whatever Putin calls it, Federation. They're fighting to stay out from under a system that treated them horribly for the previous century. This is also struggled, it's different in a couple ways from anything we've been a part of in recent times. This is not Vietnam. Some of us are old enough to remember, some participated in Vietnam, that war. It's not Iraq, it's not Afghanistan. Ukrainians are doing their own fighting, combat troops. People flying fighter missions. They're fighting and dying for themselves. And so far, all the resources that we've helped them with, our NATO allies have matched. So Europe's paying for half of the effort to help Ukrainians defend themselves. It's my tendency to want to help the underdog. It's my tendency to want to help the victim. But it's strongly my tendency to want to help people who are willing to help themselves. Fight with the intensity. And who would have ever guessed the mightiest army in the world, the Russian army, is being pushed back in a whole bunch of places by the Ukrainian army, dramatically smaller. We'll see how this comes out. But if you let Putin absorb Ukraine, how do you make sure it doesn't become 1938 or 1939 or 1940 all over again? We'll talk more about that if you care to. On the other side of the world is truly the long-term direct threat to us. And that's the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. We've seen in recent days where the president announced that the system of 5-year terms, President and General Secretary of the Communist Party, two titles. The system of a 5-year term with an option for a second 5-year term, and then you change power. It was agreed to after Mao died. He suddenly doesn't think that's necessary anymore. So he's now started his 3rd term as President and General Secretary. That's beginning to look like a lifetime self-appointment, or some people would call it dictatorship. We can talk more about that in a moment if you care to. They are really frightening and are a real direct threat to their neighbors. And from the Science Committee's perspective, how do we keep their efforts copying or buying or stealing our technology from consumers? If imitation is the ultimate form of flattery, then the Chinese Communist Party is laying flattery on us by the ton. So we're working on those issues. We'll talk about chip factories and all that if you care to. Setting that aside, what else? I know I sound a little pessimistic, but I am still a wheat farmer by trade. I am still an optimist. It will start raining shortly. I dusted in with no subsoil moisture. I've had a ½ inch. I think when I get home from having been on the road now for days, that I'll see little sprouts between the clods. So it's got to continue to at least sprinkle some. I'm not sure where the next batch of seed comes from. I'm an eternal optimist. But thank goodness we did the 14th Farm Bill with the language designed not only to address crop but livestock drought. The pattern's got to change. I do offer, though, one optimistic side. Kind of like my great aunt who believed that you put, she was still old school, she loved that castor oil with a little orange juice on top of it down her throat. She was convinced that would make you healthy. Old school. Cattle markets. The drought is offloading cattle in our region of the country at an amazing clip. Just an amazing clip. The last projections I saw, unless it starts raining pretty soon, we will almost be back to the 2014 on the cow numbers. That's going to take us down to the point where, when it does start raining, be prepared for a dramatic price increase in breeder cattle and replacements. My father claimed that when they came out of the drought of 52, 3, 4, 5, 6, that for a while, heifer prices were higher than steer prices because the need for replacements was so incredible, which reduces even more cattle that go to the feedlots and more to go to the processing plants. if we can just hold on a little longer. And again, weather patterns change. We'll have some good livestock years. As long as you can disagree with me if you want on that. But we're talking about livestock. One last issue, throw the floor open. There's been a great deal of concern for some time about the fact that we have 4 packers who any day process between 75 and 85% of beef cattle. That's a legitimate concern. When Donald Trump was president, he ordered the Justice Department to begin an anti-monopoly, antitrust, is anyone violating the 21 Stalkers Act investigation. That investigation is continuing under the Biden administration. We can talk more about this one if you care to. For the life of me, none of us in Congress can get a progress report out of the Justice Department. They're just clammed up. I believe that when they say it is for the following reasons of telling the truth. That kind of investigation is not just a civil action. It's not just are you violating the monopoly and the antitrust laws. It's also a criminal investigation. Is there collusion within the industry to manipulate supplies or to manipulate prices? People go to jail for that kind of stuff. So do not expect legislation on these kind of issues until this is done. Which I hope is soon, but whenever it's done, don't expect any laws to be passed until we see what justice does. If they break up the big 4, or if they go after the top 6 or 8 or whatever, I wouldn't remind my fellow cattlemen and women this. We will go through some amazing gyrations. In my lifetime, the Justice Department, if you remember 1982, determined that Mall Bell was a monopoly. It blew up Mall Bell phone company, and we wound up with 7 baby bells. It is that magnitude of power they have. Because if they determine it's the case, they convince a federal judge it's the case, then they will bring an order about redoing the industry. Be prepared for some gyrations there. We can talk about that one moment if you care to. Again, glass is half full. It's going to rain tomorrow. We're going to continue the Farm Bill program. Crop insurance will be there. We're going to continue to invest in research. We're going to get back to the moon and on Mars and stay ahead of the Chinese Communist Party. New control in the House, maybe the Senate. Oh, one last thought. 2024. I get lots of questions about 2024 and the general presidential campaign. We just offer this to you. Right now, both President Biden and former President Trump believe they're running for office. They're both totally convinced they're going to be on the ballot in 2024. I would suggest to you that there are a lot of things that could happen in the next 12 months. President Biden, in fairness, is showing a lot of wear and tear. If at some point he decides he doesn't run again, then that shakes up the Democratic Party's presidential nomination process. I personally don't see the vice president stepping into the role. I don't know who would step into the role. It changes things dramatically on that side of the table. President Trump's best opponent, if he runs again, is Joe Biden. If Joe Biden's not there, then there has to be assessments. Donald Trump's not the kind of guy who's going to lose twice in one lifetime. So we'll see how it sorts out. If they're both on the ballot, then I was wrong. You can laugh at me in 2 years. If it's entirely a whole new set of faces, then you heard it here first. We'll see. With that, the floor is yours. Again, thank you for the university for access to wonderful facilities. Let's talk about what you want to talk about. Give everybody a chance. And by the way, as I always say, I don't pretend to know everything. But Luke and Emma have pencil and paper. If I can't answer your question, we'll get you an answer. And of course, sometimes people speak to me. Sometimes you speak through me. And if you've been enough of my town meetings, you know sometimes folks just chew on me. So, the floor is yours.
Congressman Jordan Green, Northwestern News.
Yes, sir.
First of all, so I want to come back to the Farm Bill in a minute, but I want to ask, what's the status of President Biden's student debt relief program, executive order?
It's tied up in the courts just this moment. I'm not an attorney, and I haven't been in D.C. now for weeks. It was tied up in court. And I'm not sure the particulars. I know there were cases filed in a number of areas of the country, most of which were rejected by district courts. This apparently has been picked up by one of the courts of appeal, circuit courts. It's a controversial program. I'm on a college campus, but it's a controversial program. I worry that it is creating a break in society, because I've had more than one person say, I went to work at 18 or 20. I work every day. I'm trying to get my kids into career tech or community college, four-year comprehensive. I'm supposed to pay for somebody else's education? An education that should enable them to live a better life, have more earning potential. Is that fair? It's the point being made by my constituents, and it was done by executive order. It's being appealed in the courts. If it all sorts out, it's one of those cases where I look my folks in the eye and say, if it's actually going to be implemented and you qualify, you better fill out the paperwork. Absolutely.
Now, is there any way for Congress to defund an executive order like that? Or would there even be an appetite?
No, it is possible. But this is the question. How quick can the administration and their lawyers persuade the judge to make a decision, or the panel? It's a panel judge deal, I think. And if they say, no, this can go forward, how fast can you get the money out the door? Because once the money's out the door, it's academic. And by the same token, just as there are some who are concerned about not benefiting them, so if you run a bill to do away with it before it's implemented, you're going to infuriate a few folks on the other side too. So it's in the courts. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Again, as I tell folks, qualify, and it happens. It's in your enlightened self-interest, as we used to say in ag econ, to make a rational decision.
Talking about the Farm Bill, if Democrats end up retaining control of Congress, do you think farmers in Northwest Oklahoma or anywhere in Western Oklahoma can expect to get anything good out of it, or is it going to be more geared towards social justice?
I think there'll be a huge focus on social justice. Remember, in the very beginning of the Biden administration, when they passed their first big COVID relief bill, 90+% wasn't quite directly related to COVID issues, but they tried to come up with a program to forgive all minority farmers mortgages and operating loans. Forgive them completely. The problem that the committee found under the Democrat leadership was, how do you define a minority farmer? I suspect some folks at the White House and at the committee on the majority side had a very limited definition. But when they went to actually try to turn it into legislation, first go around, I understand, was a definition was used from the 90s, which basically defined a minority farmer as anybody but a Caucasian male. Anybody but. And that clearly spread the money out in a bigger fashion than they intended. So they came back then and picked up a definition from the 70s that said anybody but a Caucasian for Farm Bill programs was a minority. So they went with that. And under USDA rules, you self-identify whether you're a minority or not. You say what your status is, and it's accepted. Because Secretary of Ag was asked that question in the Ag Committee hearing. How are you going to verify who qualifies for having their mortgage and their operating loan paid off? Well, we've always taken people at their word, he said. That's a paraphrase, but it's real close. So, that's the language they use. It gets signed into law as a part of the bill, the overall COVID bill. The problem is it goes down to USDA's lawyers who say, there's maybe 20 or 30 different statutes on the law that affect these issues. And this bill doesn't supersede any of that. This is just a layer on top. And that's when the administration discovered, even if you define everybody but a Caucasian as a minority farmer, there was no way for USDA to go out and pay off notes, operating notes, and mortgages at commercial banks. They could only forgive mortgages and operating notes that were either direct from USDA or guaranteed by USDA. So suddenly the pool shrank rather dramatically. And then there was one other little nuance. When they ran the first numbers, I understand, and remember, minority being not just African American, but Hispanic American, Asian American, Pacific, everything imaginable. Oh, and by the way, Native Americans. When they ran the numbers, they discovered that the $5 billion they'd set aside for the minority program, I'm told, $1.5 billion was coming to Oklahoma alone. Well, we have 39 Indian tribes. We have freedmen descendants. We have people who came over from after the Vietnam War from Laos and Vietnam. Just huge number. So that language then got tied up in 3 different federal district courts and was never implemented because they couldn't make it. Just blew them up. I thought it was pretty cute that a state where the president carried how many counties was going to get $1.5 billion with $5 billion. So they're trying other gyrations of that. But I would suggest to you on forgiving minority farmers' loans, I think I understand where they're coming from, but that's not fair. You can have just as hard a time starting out in farming or staying in farming if you were a non-minority. That's a minority. It's just not fair. There's also been some movement in recent days where they've turned some money loose to help people make their payments for the funded minorities. Is that the FSA people in the room? Anyway, the way the administration interpreted the rules and the way they've implemented it, if you were behind on your payments, they would make your payment. But if you were current on your payment, if you scraped up everything in the world so you wouldn't go into default, then you weren't going to qualify for help. I mean, just bass backwards again. Just the most amazing thing. This is why the 14th Farm Bill, where we rewrote all the policies and we created the 3rd generation, took 2.5 years. You can't do this stuff halfway, sloppy. You got to legislate for real every time. The bunch just can't do it. That's a sarcastic but a realistic observation. They just can't get it done.
Congressman, going back to what you talked about with the occupations, and as we're trying to help meet the critical workforce in Oklahoma right now with nursing and teachers, you brought up STEM, and I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
What do you see in the areas of STEM that a place like Northwestern could look to? Obviously cybersecurity, those types of things, but what do you see coming down the pipe that we can prepare for?
All those kind of issues. I mean, that's where the growth is at. On the committee, we're trying to encourage industry who will benefit from all these great people to work with us in crafting STEM programs that will get that access and opportunity out everywhere. I use the phrase rural STEM, but that could be Alva, that could be Hollis, that could be anywhere. There's lots of things now that can be done remotely. The Intels of the world, the Googles of the world, and for that matter, Ford and General Motors, Tesla, they have the ability to do things where we don't have to go to some big city. And that's what we're pushing on now. If we ever get past the supply chain issues so that Business America can focus again, I think we'll have some more success. This is one of those issues where your folks have always been good to work with us down through the years. As the opportunities available, as we start to do things, as I'm the chairman, stay in real close touch. Because when that window opens, you want to jump through it immediately.
And in terms of your broadband, it is an important issue in rural Oklahoma. And although we've had some money come into the state, we're still seeing a lot of rural communities are still struggling to get broadband that they need. Can you speak to, are there some things that we need to be doing differently to help?
No, you're working on applying for the grants and stuff that comes from USDA and other entities. What we basically, in my opinion, need is a master plan that's practical. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm very friendly with all of my providers in Oklahoma, both investor-owned and co-op proprietorship. But we're never going to have super high-speed cable at the end of every dirt road in every county. The question is, how do we create a hybrid system that gives everybody access? College campuses, banks, businesses, hospitals, you're going to have real fiber connections. You have to have dependability, consistency to do it. But this may entail some of the satellite internet providers for some of us who live at the end of the dirt road. But you just can't make the kind of investments. It's the old classic argument between the co-ops and the investor-owned utilities. Investor-owned utilities have so many customers per mile. Co-ops have so many miles between customers. Balancing all this stuff out. I'm not necessarily an Elon Musk fan. His satellite-based internet service has some real enthusiastic people who've been able to get into the early stage deployments. But again, we still have to have a hard fiber system for what you do for commercial use that's absolutely dependable. Satellites still occasionally have weather events that block them up, no matter what. We've got to make the investment. Because if we don't, people under, I used to say 40, but I'm not sure now, I shouldn't say under 50, if they don't have access, they're going to go somewhere else. Whether it is the fun side of the equation or the work-related stuff. I would tell you through the worst of COVID, when we were shut down in Congress and doing everything by Zoom and WebEx and all that stuff, it was a horrible experience where I was trying to work. Sort of the whole committee meetings by Zoom, trying to work that stuff. And I would always open up in every meeting, whether it was science or financial services, whatever. I'd open up with the comment, understand, I'm at home on the farm. I'm at the end of the dirt road. I'm at the end of the rural water line. I'm at the end of the electric co-op line, and I'm at the end of the copper phone line. And at some point, I'm going to go. So I probably did the best job of advertising for those at the end of the water. And especially my younger neighbors and my more adopted neighbors, whether it's trading cattle or buying inputs, it's a business issue now in the production area. Can't freeze up in the middle of even those high cattle sales online. You just can't. We've got to make sure that we get our share of the resources. And by going this combination route, we're going to have to pull from different directions. That is an absolute necessity.
So far, all the federal government has done to try to fight inflation appears to be raising the interest rate. Would you be in favor of price controls like we had back in the 70s?
I'm old enough to remember Richard Nixon's price controls. And yes, he was a Republican president. And for my old cattlemen in the room, and women, you'll remember, we went into the price controls in what, 72? They came off in 74. Maybe 71 or 72. And they caught us in the low number of cattle cycle. And they locked in the prices. And cow numbers picked up. I'm speaking from a very personal perspective. Cattle numbers picked up. And when price controls went off, suddenly we went from a 12-year low in cattle numbers base price to a 6-year high. My father's house, you suck your belt up. I ate more Great Northern beans over the next 2 years. Because because we got caught on the backside. The cattle market disintegrated in '74. It was almost as bad as my predecessor, Glenn English, used to talk about. Remember the dairy buyout? What was that year? 80, 78, something like that? They put all those milk cows through the hamburger grinder and hammered beef prices. Glenn told me that was the only time he really needed bodyguards at his public events. Those were the cattle market collapsed. So I'm hesitant about price controls. That causes all kinds of distortions. What is inflation? It's too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. How do you fix it? Well, on the one hand, as we come out of COVID, people go back to work, we make things, we build things, we provide more services. The things we're buying, the availability goes up. But we also spent a huge amount of money in 2.5 years on COVID. International debt's $31 trillion now. Huge amount of money. So you will see, again, I believe the House control will flip, and that's where spending and tax bill starts under the Constitution. You'll see a dramatic tightening of spending in the House of Representatives. It's going to require some reprioritization on money, but tightening. The Federal Reserve System, of course, all the way back to the property boom and bubble and bust of 8 and 9, has operated on low interest rate principle. And we went into COVID, they dramatically cranked up the quantitative easing. The best way that I describe quantitative easing is just printing money. They create the bonds, they sell themselves, and then they buy. It just creates money. But Powell is trying to squeeze down on that. And the interest rates is a part of it. But I also suggest to you, how many years could you get a mortgage if you were in a community where property was turning over reasonably well? 3.5%, 4%, a 20-year mortgage? When I took money in banking in college, the old professor's lecture was for 500 years, interest rates, real interest rates are inflation rate plus 4%. All the way back to the Italians, the 1400s. If that's the case, then real interest rates should be 12% right now. So we've been operating in truth at a negative interest rate. My mother passed away a couple of years. She was a product of the Great Depression, very sensitive about equities and stocks and the wild bond market. She wanted her FDIC insured account. What have those been worth for the last 10 years? 1%? 0.5%? My grandmother Lucas, puppy student at college, in the height of the inflation stuff, I have a discussion with her. My dear grandmother was a young woman in the Great Depression. She was telling me about her 13% money market certificate at the bank. How great that was. I said, Grandmother, I love you dearly, but I think the inflation rate this year is 18. You're only losing 5 cents on the dollar. She thought, popped my head off. How could you be losing money at 13%? That's the wickedness about inflation. It shifts resources around. Look how much money we artificially restrain interest rates. How much money the credit card companies have made? We borrowed 2, loaned it out at 16, and I know they're 18 or 20, and I know there are loss issues that have to be addressed. But we have to get back to more rational policies on spending and on interest rates, the economy to make rational decisions. So, Congress spends less, Federal Reserve System slows down on the stimulus, we have to work our way back into balance. And it will not be a joyful experience. Some of us remember the early 80s. I borrowed cap feet money when I was a senior in college at 17%. I was so happy to get it. I was so happy Mr. Mails loaned it to me. 17%. When I told that story to my staff, who've all lived in the modern era, they just look at me like I'm crazy. That was the world. Volcker, remember, strangled it out. And in fairness, in addition to that, it's things like the Russians invading Ukraine and the world saying, no, we're not going to buy any more potash from Belarus, one of Putin's subject states, and Putin, who used Russian natural gas to use predatory pricing basically to drive out natural gas production in the rest of the world for 10 years, and suddenly we don't have that anymore. And it all just, it's everything bad happening at once this year economically that's created this mess.
And for us, that's a drought on top of that.
And drought on top of that. Because it doesn't matter what prices are, you can't raise something. I mean, I haven't bought fertilizer in a year because there's nothing to put it on, no rain. But again, thank goodness from Ag's perspective for the programs dating back to 14 both on crop and livestock. But also remind my press friend, that no matter what people say in their funny little postings on the internet, crop insurance never makes a farmer rancher whole. It just helps you convince the banker and your landlord and maybe your spouse that you can try it one more time. It's not making you money, it's just getting you to the next year. For those of you who use it, I think that's a fair observation. Just get you to the next year. Yeah.
I needed 3 bales of hay for hayride this weekend, and I had trouble finding them.
Oh, absolutely.
I actually turned them after I used them.
Absolutely. Most closely guarded thing Linda Lucas has is about 40 small bales for the sick bin of Plains Blue Stem 3 years ago sitting in the barn. This can't be replaced. Just can't be replaced. I'm counting around bales very carefully left over from last year to see what happens. But if it doesn't rain, again, from my cabin in the room, most of us are spring calvers in western Oklahoma. You calve out, you have the summertime, calves get fat, you sell them in the fall. And after you sell calves, most people, not all, most people preg test. If you've got barren ones that have done well in the summertime, they go straight to the vacuum plant. There's no telling what the restaurants on the East Coast are charging for some 12-year-old fat cow that they call a perfect steak. And the skinny ones, then you roll over to the spring and you sell. But this year, if they didn't calve, they went to town. I told somebody in another town, I said, you know, it's not just the old traditional adage that when things get really tough in a drought, you only have cows that have 2 clear eyes, 4 good quarters, 4 good feet. Now, they don't remember when Barack Obama was president. Because if they're 7 years old, they're gone, or 6. Linda had a bull, bad foot, 2 weeks ago. The vet said couldn't be saved. And where we were was closer to Hobart. The veterinarian there's a buying point for Cavenders at Hereford. So I call down and I say, 1,800-pound bull, he can't really, doesn't need to go home, he needs to go somewhere. And the polite lady said, you bet, we want him. It'll be 3.5 weeks before he was placed on the truck. Because they were booked up for 3.5 weeks, primarily with cows. Got no pasture, can't buy hay. Pellets are reflecting the gyrating corn prices. 3.5 weeks. So he's in the nursery waiting for a trip. He'll make some awesome hamburger.
I knew a man in the Panhandle who passed away recently that had 11 crop circles. Surrounding states, Texas and Kansas, are metering those wells. Do we have a law in Oklahoma concerning the number of acre-feet of water that producers can pump out of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is now dropping at 1 foot per year?
Now, I'll be honest, it's been a while since I was a member of the State House of Representatives, but you have the Oklahoma Water Resources Board that has control over water in the state. It was law adopted in '63. And to irrigate, whether it's surface water or underground water, my understanding is I don't have irrigation where I live, I just don't have the water. But you have an allocation and you can only use that much. The question becomes, at what point do entities start to ration? Now, of course, in lots of these places, they lower the wells and go deeper, but your water quality deteriorates as you go deeper and deeper. I actually spent yesterday afternoon at the Robert S. Kerr Water Research Facility data talking about those kind of issues. And where they're at, of course, they're dealing with not just how you efficiently use the water you have and the quality, but they're talking about places, how do you increase what's the term, the recharging of the aquifers in places like the eastern half of Oklahoma, where they get dramatically more rainfall. You can actually talk about getting water back in the aquifers. And what does that entail, and what you bring from surface contaminants? There's all sorts of issues. Crimson Panhandle, it takes a long time for that rain at 13 inches to accumulate 500 feet underground. Ironically, the research people, by examining the water and the isotopes that are in it, the things the raindrops picked up as they came through the clouds, can tell you with a reasonable approximation of when the water fell out of the sky that just pops, comes up out of your plant. I find it fascinating. A lot of it goes back to the atomic bomb testing in the 40s and 50s, because it put things in the air that did not exist before, that very defined deterioration patterns. Thank you. I find it fascinating.
Alva comes from the Cimarron Terrace aquifer down in the Cimarron River with the Clean Harbors hazardous waste plant right across the river. So we worry about that constantly. And also, we're going to have less pressure on that aquifer thanks to Enid running a pipeline over the Call Reservoir. But our aquifer recharges from surface water, and we get a lot of contaminants. And the wells that pump the most water are the ones with the most nitrate.
And that's what a big part of what the Robert S. Kerr facility is all about. We address those nitrate issues and how they mitigate. Some of your neighbors farther south, Weatherbrook's Clinton is an example where in the 11, 12, 13, 14 drought, their municipal lake went completely dry. And towards the end of the 14 drought, Foss Lake that they draw upon in a number of other communities got to where the intake pipes were just almost above the water line. So Clinton spent a fortune. The city actually sets on a, I don't know what the appropriate phrase would be, salty or briny, but they set a top aquifer that has a substantial amount of water, but salt issues, sodium issues. So they built, after they almost ran out of water, they built a facility. I can't quote you what it cost, but it was some real money, and it would be real money to run, to take the salt out of the water so they could still flush the toilets and make the sinks work. They went to that extreme, drilling into a saltwater aquifer, brine, what the proper term is.
Well, at least they weren't recycling sewage, because I just could not find that very powerful.
It was raised on a farm, the septic system, I understand.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for your moderate, matter-of-fact tone. And I would value knowing your optimism about what the week after the election may look like in terms of, acceptance of the results.
Again, I'm an internal optimist. The glass is always half full. I think in a variety of areas that don't get so much national attention, we're actually making some progress in Congress. Now, I know we're still defined as the skunk of all skunks, but hey, nobody likes school lunch either. There's some things that are traditional. The potential on the scientific side and the research side is there. I think we get a grip on the economic policy. I would hope Mr. Putin at some point decides it's time to go home. The sooner the better. We'll just have to keep an eye on our friends on the other side of the Pacific. But my late father, born in 1931, started school in 1937. My parents were a young married couple in the drought of the 50s. Went through the cattle market bust of 1974. My father always used to say, when you look at the broad picture of life, these are the good old days. Compared to where we were 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 100 years ago, these are the good old days. And tomorrow will be much better. suggest to people, it's like energy. We are doing the kind of basic research that will take us past our present existing forms of energy. And I'm a big natural gas guy. It's the clean transition fuel, cleanest, cleaner, however you want to describe it, transition fuel that gets us to that next stage. Will that be modular, smaller, fifth generation fission atomic power plants? Think about the traditional way we've made electricity from nuclear power since the 1950s. That's also a transition fuel. Ultimately, where we go is fusion. Using the mechanics of the sun, not splitting atoms, combining atoms. Take essentially water and create power with no radiation, and other than a little H2 at the end of the pipe, no waste there. That's where we ultimately go. Now, is that 15 years or 50 years or 150 years? I cannot answer that question. You as taxpayers are spending lavishly. Corporate America is spending lavishly. The Chinese and the Europeans are spending lavishly. We all know what the target is. But you get to a form of power where you have no emissions, where you have an ocean full of fuel. That will be like going from whale oil to kerosene. It will be that dramatic a change. And on the fusion stuff, the complication is they can mimic the sun. But how you handle that plasma, that mass, that is so intensely hot, is the key. And so far, it appears that using giant magnets, magnetic fields to hold it, is the way to go. Every month, the yield on the experimental plants gets a little higher. Because it takes so much energy to fire this up and so much energy to maintain it. When you get to the point, whether it's either in Europe or what the Chinese are doing, or we're doing, or the Navy's doing, or corporate America is doing, or the Europeans are doing, once you get to the point where more energy comes out than goes in, then we start that path. It will change the world. Now, that said, it's far enough down the road. If you get an oil and gas check, don't worry. That's still going to be needed for a long time. A long time. Things like that will fundamentally change the course of human existence. And then, humor me for a moment on the science stuff, then you can talk about going off work. You have that kind of a power generation source, with Pluto with ice, or moons of Mars and Jupiter with ice balls, and suddenly, all sorts of amazing things become possible. Thank you for letting me have my what if moment. What if?
Sure.
You get to be the last question.
Last one, okay, well, I'm going to make it count, but it's going to be kind of a bizarre question, which I'm sure you've never had any of those before.
Never.
You talked at length about your work on the science committee and all these pioneering forms of energy. Let's tie that back into the drought. Is there any discussion of potentially cloud seeding to help end droughts in this part of America?
There's actually cloud seeding research going on, not just in the United States, but around the world. In different ways and different things they put in the atmosphere. But not enough progress has been made to really call that a potential panacea. In the Middle East in particular, some of the super oil-rich countries, where they have lots of moisture come up off the Gulf, but doesn't ever seem to turn to rain. They're investing a lot of effort and dollars into it. We'll see. Go back to my grandfather's comment that we all need to tie better. So, whatever the case may be. Again, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. If you want to come to Woodward, you can cross-reference me.